So what happens to what humans leave behind? And you're probably thinking, well, what does that have to do with the Maya? A lot of people say that. But one of my main interests now is soil fertility, how soils, perhaps, how the decomposition of the built environment affects modern soils and their fertility. But why I'm interested in it and why I think it's important is this is important whether the climate changes or not. And I've often said this in grants, which I think probably I shouldn't have, but even if the climate doesn't change, if it's perfect, there's a problem with soil. And from the reading I've done, and I'm not a soil scientist, but I've read a lot of literature. I've also read a little bit about average global crop yields, which are apparently decreasing under present methods. Insufficient nutrients have been an agronomic problem for many, many years in many areas. And in some of the literature, I've read that the ability of cereal crops, like wheat and oats, to deliver full yields has fallen. So I'm mentioning these to emphasize that there is a problem with soil fertility. The other condition that could be addressed is how the availability of soil, which I'll go into in more detail, but the concept of, soil security, which is soil as a resource, is threatened. I've already mentioned rapid rates of soil degradation. My colleague, young lecturer, Dan Evans, who I've worked with for a few years, some of his publications show that over 90% of conventionally managed soils are thinning. Right? They're not as much available, with 16% having lifespans of less than 100 years. And the other thing is, and he agrees with this, that there are shortcomings in traditional approaches to soil management. So what does archaeology have to contribute? Well, I think we are acutely aware of the fact that everything around us will decay eventually, or will disintegrate, including us, all right? I know it seems a little depressing, but it's true, okay? Dust to dust. And we know that because we dig cities that no longer exist, that have decomposed and are now, mounds in the soil. And in the process of decomposition, the products of decomposition contribute to the buildup of the earth around us. Okay? So what good is archaeology? Well, I think archaeology can add a huge dimension to studies of how soils can rejuvenate or become sustainable. I won't say more sustainable, although a lot of my colleagues say that, but something is either sustainable or it isn't. I don't see how it could be more sustainable. But archaeology, one of the things we can do is provide chronologies of settings where dense populations have lived for very long periods of time. We do have that knowledge. We can provide data on diachronic factors, long-term diachronic factors that affect agricultural viability of soils and land use, which are lacking in present studies. Present studies are not long-term. What they consider long-term is maybe 30 years, 2 generations, whereas we know about hundreds of years. And we dig through deposits that are the product of the decay of what people once thought would last forever. And who knows more about what people throw away, abandon, behind, or bury than us? So I say PFE, Past and Future Earth, is what I've called the group of us who were trying to get grants to study this. We do know that there's a long-term positive impact on soil formation associated with dense populations and the range of activities that characterize urbanism. There's a lot of good things that come from a lot of people living together and building together. But what our goal is, which has been really difficult to achieve, is to develop a methodological inquiry that, in other words, to study exactly how decomposition proceeds in a sample site from first habitation to the modern soil, and provide environmental studies and other related studies with a method or methodology of approaching studies of long-term impact of human populations. But this is what we haven't been able to get funding for. And then I work in the neotropics, and you might, well, I've already really addressed this to some extent, why I think the neotropics is so interesting. It's not only that high populations were developed in the absence of a grazing animal complex, so that we should be able to learn something about the better management of plants and forests, but also what I've talked about, this concept of soil connectivity, that among the Maya, and among other peoples in Mesoamerica, the structure of the urbanism, we think, has produced or has given people, we can say that soil connectivity is part of their lives, which it isn't always for us who live in heavily built environments. So I think we can learn from the neotropics. So what questions are we asking? We're asking which human activities change the character of the occupied land surfaces in the past, either via topographic modification or via additives. And the additives, I don't mean like adding fertilizer, I mean abandoning buildings, human waste, kitchen waste, that sort of thing. What activities have been responsible for changing the character of the land surfaces? And what role do these changes have in long-term soil formation? So that the modern land surface can be said to be the product of the effects of many years of human occupation. And I have to say, in recent years, we haven't been able to get funding, but originally, I did have trouble. I had trouble in Canada, and it wasn't until the Leverhulme Trust came through with funding between 2013 and 2016 that we were able to do initial studies and initial publications, but haven't been able to build on that. I may go back to Leverhulme, but although we get good reviews, we don't get the grants, and I don't know why. So can we link human behavior that has a range of purposes unconnected to improving soil? And this is maybe where people are not willing to provide funding, because a lot of my colleagues who do study Precolumbian ways of life tend to emphasize deliberate efforts by Precolumbian peoples to improve the soil, which we should be doing. So the emphasis is on purposeful activity, whereas I'm saying I don't care what they thought. People lived, died, pooed, abandoned buildings, left stuff around, lost things. All of these things have affected the development of soil profiles. So in a sense, I don't care what they had in their heads. I care what they left behind and how that has affected soil formation. So that's why I say unconnected to improving soil, such as construction, human household or industrial waste, burial of the dead. Big, very important, but very little studied in terms of the long-term effects of burying people in the ground. So what are the effects on land uses that maintain or increase soil health and productivity? Now, so I thought I'd give you a little insight as to why I ever thought about these things. And I have thought about it since I first started my own project in the Stan Creek district of Belize in 1975. And on the coast, it was especially evident when we came across coastal sites that the vegetation was so different. And this is one of the first I excavated, called Caye. It's in central southern Belize. I think you can see the difference in the vegetation between this little spot, and this is largely mangrove, actually. And I did a lot of work there for my PhD, and this is what the environment was like. There were broadleaf forest trees right in the middle of mangrove swamps, broadleaf forest vegetation, and wherever humans had occupied the site for a long time, you got improved soils and improved vegetation. So that really interested me. And if you ask people about it in Belize, it was interesting. They would say, oh, the Maya put good soil in their canoes from the mainland, and they brought it out to these sites. Interesting. But at that time, there were geographers. Belize was still a British colony, and there were geographers who had done a land use survey, and they published a wonderful book in 1959 on the soils in Belize. And I met the editor, David Romney, and he inspired me to look at this phenomenon as a, what would you call it? What's the term? Not exogenous. That it was not in that space. Nobody brought soil anywhere. This was something that happened as the result of humans occupying that space, and the soil changed. And so that kind of changed my life even back then. Got me interested in dark earths in the Amazon. So that's where it started. So then you might say, well, you know, why a key? Well, I've mentioned that those were the first, when I say a key, the islands off the coast or on the coastal mainland, those were the first communities where I noticed the association between dark earths and human occupation, intensive human occupation. Most of these are what I would call peri-urban communities. Yes, they fish, but they trade, and they're closely connected to all of the big sites on the mainland. But the other thing about a key, as opposed to a site like Lamanai, is that we can isolate the baseline conditions, because the parent rock is a form of limestone, right? It's the limestone that develops in the sea. So it's more easily controllable than on the mainland, where the geology is much more complex. So knowing what the parent material is and its qualities makes it easier to trace changes over time. But I've also become interested in Lamanai as a place to study, and we do have a student working there. It is an urban center, but I've become interested in the fact that they used what are called now mineral-based construction materials, which is anything that's related to limestone, lime, plaster, mortar, because one of the big interests today is the use of cement, because apparently the production of cement produces a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. So I'm part of a group at the university who is studying ways to minimize carbon output, but I'm the only one who says that burying the ruins of buildings is a good thing. Mostly they're trying to limit the production of carbon in cement manufacture, and waste is considered a bad thing. Whereas I'm saying, you know what, over the long term, waste is a good thing because it returns resources to the environment. But there's so much emphasis now on recycling, which is good, but if you recycle something, it gets thrown away eventually. No one wants to think that far ahead. And the emphasis in the circular economy is to minimize waste, whereas I'm saying no. The emphasis is on looking at the kind of waste we produce and how it can best be buried, so that in 100 years, 200 years, you've got better soil. But people don't want to look that far ahead. It's a political thing. Anyway, so both the sites where I've been working, and you've been hearing about this, Marco Gonzalez and Lamanai, they have long and continuous occupation sequences from the pre-classic to modern times. So we have good chronological control. Better at Marco Gonzalez, because Lamanai has monumental architecture, and it's really hard to get at a full sequence in that kind of situation. But at Marco Gonzalez, we can. And the other thing that I've always thought was important, but I've been criticized for this in the grant applications, which is that processes of decay, they're more rapid than in temperate climates. And I think there must have been greater awareness of decay and its impacts. And as I say, my last grant application, one of the reviewers said, well, he didn't say that, didn't send me a recording, oh, this is silly, But when I lived in Belize, and I know our children were with us at Lamanai for years, you're much more aware of how that things decay. And so you do things a bit differently because you're aware of this decay factor, the way you organize your use areas. And so I think that must have entered into environmental relations, this idea of being aware of decay, which in the temperate climate, we're not really. We build a structure, we think it's going to last forever. So just as an example, I think I've showed this photograph before, but all of the urban architecture in Lamanai is mineral-based construction material. Even the plazas, which are green here with grass, they would have been covered with plaster. So my hope in the grant was that we would look at the soil that had formed over limestone construction and look at how the decay processes worked and what the result was for modern soils. But I haven't yet been able to do that. And as I mentioned today, mineral-based construction materials are associated with carbon emissions. And I think that we should aim to show that their decay is really good for soil formation. And what I have here is a picture of Lamanai when my husband first started to work there. Now Lamanai is a reserve, so you're not allowed to farm, but the soil on the archaeological site attracted farmers from all over because it was more fertile than the soil where people didn't live in the past. So it was definitely more fertile. It was also, there was more of it. And that, my colleague Dan, which I never thought about it before, but he brought it, my soil science colleague, that the fact that there is more soil in these areas is astounding. We should be, that's fantastic, because where else can you make soil? I know the Belgians and the Germans, they have a way of making what are called plug-in soils from manure. But the fact that where humans have lived and breathed and thrown garbage away and been buried, that in time our formed soil is really important. And we should be looking at that today to plan for the future, or at least that's my idea. This is what Lamanai looks like today. And admittedly, they're not farming anymore, but it is a very lush environment where you see these cahoon trees. They're usually used by farmers as indicators of not just fertile soil, but well-drained soil. So I think that we, as archaeologists, we have the information that can really benefit what's called soil security. Now, I mentioned that I got funding from the Leverhulme Trust, and that was our first attempt to study the connections between archaeological remains and the impact on soil formation. And I'll be forever grateful to the Leverhulme Trust for that. Now we focus on Marco Gonzalez because we have the most control there, but soil formation has occurred in many places on the same island, on the same key. And this is a few years ago when we worked on San Pedro, which is now, well, it's always been a tourist attraction, but now it's heavily attracts tourists from all over the world. But you can see the dark earth here that develops over the sand. So that development goes on other places in the key. So I just wanted to go over our project so you would get some idea of what we were after. So our first question, of course, was what did people do in the past to produce what are now sediments? And that involves pretty much traditional archaeological research. Lindsay is one of the graduate students who actually worked on environmental impact. But you do have to have that basic archaeological knowledge, which I have already gone over to some extent. We don't have really early evidence, not because it's not there. We have got artifacts from earlier than, let's say, 250 AD, but it's all underwater. So I don't know how we're going to be able to get at any of that. And this is just an example, which I think you've seen before, some of the early classic vessels. Actually, the geoarchaeologist Richard McPhail encountered these when he was taking samples, and this is where they were located in the stratigraphic sequence. Then above this early classic level, we're still in the early classic, but we've encountered only in the test pits. This is where test pits are a real pain, but stones that suggested to me we were looking at a platform, the inside of a platform, the face of which was outside the test pit. So there was considerable construction one way or the other during this period. And I included this because you can see some of the stones here that they were shaped, and that the face of this construction is outside the test pit. I should say that this year, though, we uncovered a little more of those stones, and it may be more complicated than I thought. But in any case, there is evidence of considerable construction until about 600 or so, when there's this big change to salt processing. And the orange levels in the soil that you've seen here, which occur throughout the site, what they are is the disintegration of ceramics that have been used to hold a brine and put in hearths, and water is heated and it drives, the fuel is heated and it drives off the water to produce salt, which was shipped, as I mentioned, inland, either as cakes or perhaps wrapped in leaves. And that ceramics are so friable. I think they were only used once and then they fall apart, that they disintegrate and form these orange layers in the soil. These are profiles that I did way back in 1975, and they're not quite right, but the rims of these vessels are so wonky that it's really hard to figure out how exactly they were shaped. But we have found evidence of a report in Guatemala of salt making that entailed the use of bowls like ours, very friable, and they were set in a hearth, and they are indeed bowls. I'm just not so sure about what I did here with these restricted orifices, but they are pretty wonky. So they did this salt processing for 150 years or so, and then I mentioned that there is a town built over the salt processing levels, and the dating we get from these ceramics, all from burials underneath floors in the buildings. And these are just from one building, one portion of one building, where so far we haven't even completely excavated it, and I think we have over 40 burials just in one building. And they often have well-preserved pottery, as you can see here. I think the earlier ones still have polychromes, stuff that could be said to be late classic, but then it goes into the period of so-called terminal classic, when everything changes, the polychromes are no longer made, and different sorts of ceramics are made around the whole peninsula. This, in fact, comes from Tabasco, probably, from Yucatan, the Gulf Coast, Guatemala. So it's a different era. These are just some other artifacts from the same buildings, the late to terminal classic, that they do go into about 1000 AD, a little bit later, which this ceramics represent. This is actually close to the colonial period. But you can see here these little sequins. We found deposits of hundreds of these little sequins or shell, and they're from little jackets, because I've seen one that was retrieved from the cenote at Chichen, and they adorn this little vest. And we don't get that kind of preservation, but we did get all of the sequins, and they're a little bit later than some of the ceramics. So, and we have a good chronological sequence here. And just to generalize, or to show you how the stratigraphy represents these different time periods, you can see that here from maybe, we don't go any earlier than 100 to 250 here. But we do get, as I said, we do get material from below the water level, but it's just not as well stratified. But you can see that as the salt processing here, these are some of the floors from the later town, and you can see the development of the dark earth is pretty considerable. So that is one question, was the chronology, which we still have more work to do, but it's pretty good. And then we have to ask what was left behind. Well, I wished I'd used geomorphology a lot earlier, but Richard MacPhail who's a geomorphologist, worked at UCL, worked with us and took samples of the deposits and came up with some really interesting. Without him, we would not have been able to provide proof that there was salt making, but he managed to find isotropic coating on some of the pottery that records the actual tidal flat muds from which they were collecting the brine. He got evidence of many sort of very thin floors that we never would have seen with the naked eye. Disintegrating pottery, as you can see there. So the soil, the geomorphology, micromorphology was really, really helpful or is helpful. We really need to do more work in trying to figure out what was deposited in the soil, where it came from. Now, Dan, who's the person I've talked about quite a bit, who's a lecturer in soil formation at Cranfield, wasn't actually involved in that project, but since that time he has been involved with me in formulating what we can do to trace long-term degradation processes. So I'm really indebted to him. Because for years I found soil scientists not really willing to look at what humans do as affecting the soils over the long term, except degradation. They will look at humans as degraders, but not really as positive parts of the world. But Dan, thank goodness, is positive. And my colleague and friend Julia Stegeman was co-director of the project, and she introduced these ideas of how, because what she does, she's an environmental engineer, and she studies the long-term impact of modern activities, such as mining, such as cement manufacture, a whole range of things. And they use particular models to predict what the impact of these activities will be in the future. And her idea was, well, we know the impact because we know what the soil is like. Maybe we can use those models to try to figure out what led to this impact, which is a brilliant idea. We found it was a lot harder, though, than we thought. And this is what Lindsay tackled as her PhD. And she was able, with some activities, to look at what produced the modern soil surface. But it was way more complicated than we thought. It's possible, but it really needs more extensive excavation. But one of the things she focused on was lime processing, because that's very common in the Maya area, both for making plasters and for culinary purposes. And she was able to show some real heavy contamination. At the time, the lime processing was going on, but over time, the lime actually enriched the soil. She also worked on, and this is something we really need to do more work on. We also were trying to look at what materials comprised the soil deposits. And so we did a lot of sieving, and you could sort of see how the materials broke down into smaller and smaller bits, but we needed to approach it even in more detail by saving everything in the profile. And we didn't. We sieved and sieved down to a certain degree, and now we've realized that we have to approach that differently using geological sieves. And so we have a plan, but as I say, I haven't been able yet to carry it through. But determining what materials are in the deposits down to the smallest sizes is really critical. And then, of course, there's also what chemicals they contribute in this process. So even materials such as jade and chert and obsidian break down, and not all of it, obviously, because as archaeologists we find some of it. So if it did, we wouldn't be any fun. But a lot of it does break down. Lindsay also worked on trying to identify macrobotanical remains. And as far as domesticates, she did find maize and something called krabu, which is a fruit that grows it's really small, that grows on savanna soils. But these came from early deposits, so we're not really, we don't think they were a product of cultivation, but probably import. But this is one of the other questions that I now think is really important, which is, when did it become possible on the Caye to cultivate? When were these cultivable soils first in evidence? Because today, and well before the tourist industry seems to be taking over the island, you could grow tree crops, vegetables, and other crops on the island. In fact, colleagues at the University of Nottingham, one of the graduate students did find maize in later deposits that they thought were evidence of cultivation. So we do see, a change in the environment of the Caye, so that ultimately cultivable soil is formed, I guess, earlier than I originally thought, earlier than modern times. But we don't know when yet. Simon Turner is at geography at UCL. He looked at how the overall environment changed over time, and he did both surface soil samples and cores. And what the cores, this is around 400 AD, something like that. Below, the earlier time period, you see marine sediments. And then starting in the 5th century, you begin to see terrestrial sediments. So there is clearly a change as humans come to this particular site and live there, build houses, human waste, shells, fishing. The whole environment changes to a more terrestrial based environment. Oh, there it is, okay. As far as the surface soil samples, one of the interesting things is that Simon discovered mercury contamination. And he immediately thought, well, not immediately, he first thought it must be modern, people coming there, fishing, depositing batteries. But we have a couple of botanists from Royal Botanic Garden and the University of Edinburgh working with us. And they discovered that the mercury was brought up from Precolumbian deposits by some of the plants and trees. So we have this Precolumbian mercury contamination, which was written into the grant. I can't give you a solution because didn't get the grant, but it's either probably, the Maya do use mercury occasionally in caches, and it comes from cinnabars. Some of you may know. I think if cinnabar is heated in a sealed container, it will produce mercury. But the idea that they were bringing cinnabar from the the mainland out to the island to process seems a little bizarre. It's possible, and we should be able to detect that because there are different kinds of mercury. But it's also possible, I think, that there are thousands of fish bones that make up this island, thousands. And I'm wondering if maybe predator fish, might have contributed to the mercury. So this is something, if we can go on, we should be able to figure out. And then I mentioned the wonderful people from the Royal Botanic Garden who did a vegetation survey with us. We were hoping to do more, but again, it was another one of those things where I had this idea if we could map the vegetation and equate it with the subsurface characteristics, we might be able to infer more about how the built environment, like where on the site the vegetation was, let's say, where there were the most fertile soils, what underlay those. And we did show some interesting patterns, but it's really something that should be a project in itself, I learned. But Richard and Christina were just wonderful, and I just think the Royal Botanic Garden is fantastic, whereas I don't think much of Kew at all. But I'm nothing but praise for the Botanic Garden. And Christina was written into this grant, so maybe if we get funding, we will be able to continue, or I can get students to continue, because I think that's really important. The other problem, though, is that Marco Gonzalez, we won't be able to do vegetation there because it's been cleared so many times for tourism. And that's as part of the problem is finding natural vegetation on the island anymore. And then my colleague, friend, Manuel Arroyo Calens, worked in the dark earth in the Amazon. He came out. I just wanted him to have a look to see if he could see parallels. And it does turn out that we have dark earths, but they are different parent materials, of course, from the Amazon. But it's essentially the same relationship between anthropogenic soils and the environment. And Mark Pollitt is also from Cranfield. He wasn't on the original project, but he and I have cooperated in grant applications because of dead bodies. Burials are so important. And most of the studies of cadavers are either of animals in the wild or humans, but for forensic purposes. Okay? And what we need is a study of long-term soil formation in cemeteries, and well, Marco Gonzalez would also be a good place to detect, how the soils change as the result of decomposition of bodies. Because one of the things Mark told me was that decaying human, I just hope you're not offended by this, decaying human beings. Okay, everybody all right with that? Change the microfauna, fungi and other things in the soil. And that even when the body is completely decayed or just a few bones left, the soil has been so transformed that the microfauna continue to affect nutrient retention over the long term, which is really important because it means that we need to think about where we bury people for future soil. And then the other fascinating thing is what are called ecosystem engineers. Now, I imagine here and in England, we tend to look mostly at earthworms, who burrow in the soil and bring up lower levels of soil and help with the whole aeration and bioturbation. Well, out on the island and also on the mainland are land crabs, and that's what they do. They burrow down to the water level, and in the process, they bring surface material down and they bring deeper levels up. And we think that they help with, I guess you could say, soil nutrient retention, increasing nutrients in the soil. And Francesca here did her BA dissertation studying the land crabs. Now she's working at land use at Lamanai. And you can sort of see the burrow here, which I thought, from looking at the land crabs, I thought they just burrowed like down to in kind of an incline down to the water level, but in fact, the burials are spirals. And I love this shot in the upper left here. Look at this girl with the little shirt. If you're lucky, you catch them, bringing up stuff, putting it, archaeologically, you want to kill them, okay? Because forget the stratigraphy after they've had it. But from a soil nutrient perspective, they're great. And this is just one of the test bits I wanted to show you. Look at this, those little creeps. Up and down, up and down, up and down. But, as I say, from a soil nutrient perspective, they're wonderful. And there are also what are called hermit crabs. Sometimes they're called soldier crabs in Belize. I have tried to get people to study Cenobita because, unlike the hermit crabs, they occur underneath a leaf litter, and they use all of these shells. Now, where are the shells from? Humans. Hundreds and hundreds of years of collecting conch and other shells and leaving them on the island. And it is a we would say, real estate paradise for these hermit crabs, because they have hundreds of shells to choose from, and there's hundreds of them. And I'm sure that their presence must affect the soil and has done over time. But every biologist I've contacted, we just do DNA. Nobody does natural history anymore. I would have been better back in the earlier century, I think. But they all do a lot of DNA studies with Cenobita, but no one's actually interested in their behavior and how they might impact on the environment, which I think is sad. So I haven't found anyone to work on. So since the Leverhulme project, what have I done? I've applied for 5 or 6 grant applications. I think I mentioned about the AHRC-sponsored network that my friend and colleague Ben Weiss managed to get funding for. So we were able to look at some of the impact, and in my case, of waste on the environment, which I've already talked about. That's just the present team. And I also belong now, although I don't know if it will yield, well, I'm not sure whether I'll have much impact, but I belong to a policy group of the Chartered Institutes of Waste Management. So it's the first time I've managed to get myself into a group that looks at how waste is managed, today. So I hope I can stay on that in that group, and I've learned a lot from them already, and it's really, really interesting. So what's my aim in all this? And my aim is to get people to think of all the things that you see here: human waste, garbage, rubbish, dead people, construction waste, transport waste, as the source of this, as a possible source of good soil. It just takes long periods of time, but doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Good thinking, says me. That's it. And I've included the acknowledgments here for all of the projects that have been involved, both on Lamanai and Marco Gonzalez, so that should help online. But that's it. I think that's all I have. As in Forrest Gump's words, that's all I have to say about that.